Hi, everyone. My name is Chana Silver, and you'll hear more about me during the course of this class. Our topic today is suffering, trauma, loss, difficulties, tragedies, struggles, things that we all face in our life. And it's a perfect day to be talking about it because Tisha B'Av, as we know, is one where we are collectively mourning and commemorating the tragedies and difficulties that we as a Jewish nation have had for the past few thousand years. But I want to try to personalize it and really bring it home because I have definitely been around the block a few times and I've learned that looks are deceiving and that really everybody suffers with something. There's always things going on in people's lives, not always that you can see, but it's really always there. And there are important reasons why God has put suffering in the world, and hopefully we can gain some insight into understanding it and personalizing it and hopefully growing from it. So let's get started. I'd like to first speak about a very special holy book called Gesher HaChaim. That translates to be the bridge to life or the bridge of life. It was written by a very special man. His name was Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukachinsky. He was born in 1871 and he died in 1955. He lived in Israel and he was considered an expert on death and dying, the laws of mourning, the laws of how to prepare a body for burial, and all those different kinds of Jewish laws. And yet he calls his Sefer the Bridge of Life. Doesn't seem to make sense. But inside he explains something very deep, very beautiful, and I would like to say very foundational for a lot of the ideas that we're going to speak about. So the topic is life and death, as we know it anyway. But he says that's actually not quite right. It's actually life and life. And there's not just one birth and a death, but there's actually two births. So how does that work out? So he explains that the first gestational period is what we know. 9 months, a baby is growing inside its mommy's belly. And what's happening? It's getting all the things that it needs to have a successful, thriving life here in this world. So it's getting all its physical components, the blood, the nerves, the veins, the arteries, the muscles, the heart, the lungs, the eyes, skin, all those different things. And of course, at the end of 9 months, everything is pretty much ripe and ready, and the baby is born. There's a mazel tov. And that's the first birth. The second gestational period, he explains, is slightly a little bit longer. And it's about 70, 80, 90, perhaps 120 years. And that's life as we know it today. But he calls it a gestational period for the soul. And he says that the point of this world and the point of life as we live it is to work on our spiritual muscles. And God sends us many different things in our life to be able to do that. We have decisions to make and think through in a proper way. We have suffering, we have loss, tragedies, trauma, struggles, all those different things. And each thing is divinely ordained specifically just for us, for our soul. And if it's like a glove, exactly the amount of things that we need, the amount of trouble, trauma, difficulties, the happy times, and everything in between. And it's all for the purpose of development of soul. In essence, it's really the concept of a portal to eternity. That's really what we're speaking about. And so each moment of life is priceless and precious because we can gain deep and eternal things through it. I oftentimes like to speak about the idea of carpe diem, seizing the moment, seizing the day, and life is so precious, and we have to really work through each moment as we go to try to really pick up all the beautiful diamonds that are lying in the street for us and try to crystallize our eternity. And so that's kind of what he explains. And so the second gestational period is very, very big, very long. And then, of course, at what we call death, so he calls a second birth. A soul is born back into the world that they came from. They start out spiritual, and then we have a life here, and then the soul and the body separate, and the soul goes back up to the spiritual realm. These are big concepts, and there's a lot more to talk about with all of them, but just mentioning this as a foundational idea for the concept of suffering and how we can understand it in our life. And so that brings me to the next idea, which is the concept of Gam Zu L'Tova. This is something you might have heard of. It means this too is for the best, and that's how we're supposed to look at everything. And, when somebody's little, like little children, and like everything's for the best, and sometimes they've heard some songs that are Jewishly oriented, that they're going around singing, everything's for the best, and Gamzu Latova. And then you get older, and everything is not really Latova. It certainly doesn't seem very good. There's some good things that happen to us, of course, that we can see the blessings, and then there's some really horrible, difficult things that we all go through with suffering and loss and the tragedies and so many things that we each have in our own personal lives. And it doesn't seem very good at all, and it hurts like the dickens. And so how do we understand that? It must be true, because that's a very Jewishly oriented concept. It's in the deeper Jewish outlook, but how do we understand that? So I want to explain that with something that happened to a very good friend of mine many, many years ago. It's something that she thinks about and something that I think about all the time, and I teach about it. And for all the different many things that have happened in my life, I really would love to share it. So my friend was a young couple with her husband many years ago, and they had a beautiful little boy, and he died at the age of 4 months. It was a crib death, a SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome death, and he just stopped breathing. And my friend was young. She was newly married, just had the baby, and she did not feel equipped to deal with this trauma, this tragedy, and this loss. And they were sitting Shiva, and during those 7 days when someone close in the family, people close are supposed to be coming in mourning, they're supposed to be mourning, and people come to visit them and try to comfort them. And everything was just going over her head. She was in a daze. She was definitely in some sort of a trauma, and nothing was really registering. And until one particular rabbi walked in, and he told her the following story. And this particular story that I'm going to share, so this is what got her through, and she was able to begin the process of working through her trauma and her loss and her grief, and to begin to slowly become more complete with it, although nothing will ever take the place of their first baby. They have a large family now, and they've actually done amazing things and helped people in a very significant way who have also lost children, but of course it will never take away or make up for that first baby that they lost. So here was the story that the rabbi told her that began to get her through that. And so it's brought down, and it's mentioned in a preface of a very holy work from one of our rabbis that lived about 1,000 years ago, and that was the Ramban Nachmanides, and supposedly it's a true story. So what happens in that preface is the following: that there was a rabbi, an older rabbi, who was learning Torah with an older teen, maybe an 18-year-old, and this older teen was unbelievably amazing, super intelligent, and really understood things to its depth. And so this rabbi and this student were learning over many different things. The known Torah, they started to go into some of the esoteric aspects, Kabbalistic ideas, and this young teen was really absorbing everything to a very, very high degree. And the rabbi really thought that this young man was going to be one of the leaders of the next generation in terms of rabbis. And in the middle of this whole thing, this boy dies. And the rabbi is just beside himself. He doesn't understand it. God, how are you running this world? He was going to be the leader of the next generation. Like, he was absorbing everything. He really understood it. He was mature, and his brain capacity was just beyond anyone else around. God, why? And of course, we have a lot of whys in this world. And as the story is told there, so the boy came to the rabbi in a dream, and he said, "Rabbi, I cannot tell you in the lower world why my soul was taken back now. But what I can tell you is that in the Olam Ha'emes, in the true world, there are no questions. In the true world, there are no questions." And so when my friend heard this story, and there she was sitting Shiva for this beautiful 4-month-old baby, she didn't understand anything about the loss or the Jewish outlook about it. This gave her a glimmer of insight, a glimmer of hope, if you will, because listen to just what that means, right? We have a lifetime of questions. God, why? Why me? Why this? Why did these people die? Why are they suffering? What happened over here? So many questions, a lifetime of questions. We don't always get the answers here, but there are answers. Everything is jurisdicted, as we just said, by God. Fits like a glove, exactly what we need. And there's a larger picture. You see, we're very myopic. We can see what's in front of us, but there's a much larger picture of what preceded us in our soul and what is coming after this lifetime, the second gestational period. And everything has a rhyme and reason. And when a person goes into that second lifetime, if you will, or what we call death, and the soul separates from the body, and the soul goes back to where it came from. So the questions of a lifetime literally melt away. In the world of truth, there are no questions. There's no reason to even ask the questions because it's blatantly and brilliantly clear why every single thing happened. And like I said, this gave my friend some hope, and she was able to move on slowly with her life. And like I said, it's something I think about all the time. And so I wanted to share that with you. So that's one element of the Gamzu Latova, is that everything somehow is for the best. Sometimes the best really hurts terribly, but it's really the best for me. It's the best for my soul. It's exactly what needs to be happening, jurisdicted by God. It's very interesting. I'll tell you another two stories connected to this idea. And this comes from a very good friend of mine. Her husband, several years ago, was diagnosed with lung cancer. And it was obviously very devastating. And he was not all that old. They did have grandchildren at the time, but he was a vibrant, healthy person, and this was a big blow. He's a very worked out person even before this cancer, and he's a very deep person, very well thought out. And he really had a relationship with God that he had been working on for all his life. So he sat and he pondered and he thought for a little while when they got the diagnosis. And then he came to his wife and he said, you know what? Everything in God's world is good. It's true. Gamzu Latova. He says, firstly, there's all the blessings that are so open for us that I know and that I see. We have children, grandchildren. There's so many wonderful things that happen with us, and those are obviously good. But the same God that is giving me the cancer is the same God that is giving me all these blessings. And so somehow it's got to be good because my soul is connected to God. God wants only the best for each one of us. And so it's somehow got to be good. And he continued to strengthen his emunah, his faithfulness in God. And he lived for several more years than what the doctors expected. And he lived a very, very thriving life. And he was really intact with his relationship with God. And he was able to go through it with a very big stableness and a very special faithfulness in God. And so that same friend, so she went through something, I would say maybe 12 years ago, 15 years ago. It was a very big struggle for her, a very personal type of struggle. And she came out of it eventually with shining colors, but it was not easy for her. It really kind of turned her world upside down. And she mentioned to me only just a few days ago that had she not gone through that personally with her own issues and struggles, that she doesn't think that she could have coped as well as she has with her husband's illness and then subsequently with her husband's death. She's obviously going through a lot, and it's not easy. None of it's easy. But this gave her, again, a deep type of firmness and stability to go on because she was able to develop so much of herself through her own personal struggles. And so that's the second element of everything is for the good, is that we can't always see the good that will come from something that we go through. Sometimes we don't see it at all in this lifetime. And sometimes, like my friend was mentioning, sometimes you really can see when something actually happened much earlier in your life, and then it comes to a different point later, and like that difficult struggle that you went through actually is helping you now. So it's really something to think about as we go through some of these ideas and these principles and really try to dig deep personally and try to understand it somewhat and help it to help us. And so that really brings us to the next idea that I'd like to speak about, and there's a tripod on this idea, and it's the idea that really the difficulties, the struggles, the loss, the tragedy, the trauma that we go through can really help build us and can really help complete us in a way that having just a regular type of tra-la-la life is but a dream, may not. How many people do you know that were actually made because of their struggles, their traumas, their losses, right? There's some people who really end up building themselves. It's actually all about choice. If we make the right choices while we're going through the difficulties, so then we really can come out on top through the struggle. It's kind of like if we're working out, no pain, no gain. So we've got to go through the pain, and then we can really gain great things again for our spiritual muscles as we are living in this second gestational time period. If a person just has that easy life, it could be that they will be more shallow, perhaps more superficial. Maybe they won't be so have so much compassion, maybe lacking compassion. Maybe they'll be even slightly arrogant, not so sensitive. just totally generalizing. But if a person has seemingly an easy life, they're not necessarily so deep or having gone through certain things. But if a person goes through difficulties and struggles and makes the right choices and is able eventually to come out on top and be successful through it, so they may become really much more deeper people with sensitivities, be empathic, and be humble, and then ultimately be able to share their experience with people who are struggling with the same kind of thing and will be able to help them as well. It's a total generalization, but if you think about it, we really can be made and built through our difficulties. Um, and also the whole idea of sometimes we have to redefine our lives through our struggles and through our losses. And now we have to try to live life in a deep and meaningful way when we don't have certain things that we had before or that things have been significantly changed. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about my parents and tell you a couple of stories about my mother within some of this information that I learned so much from. So I'm a Southern gal. My dad was from Mississippi. My mom was from Tennessee. And they became Bali Tshuva in their late 20s, early 30s. I'm the baby of the family. And they were quite a bit older. I have much older siblings. And so our household was a growing Baal Tshuva household. And they had the warmth and the openness of the South. And you put that all together, it's a great combination. And I learned very much from the role models that my parents were. And so what happened in terms of the idea that we're talking about being able to grow, to actualize our potentials. We have so many amazing elements of potential and capacities and abilities and capabilities that might just be lying dormant. And through going through the difficulties that God serves us up, it could be that we'll be able, of course, with the right choices that we make and the right attitude, to be able to really develop ourselves. And so I really watched this with my mother, and she did have to redefine herself at some point. My mother was the type, she was a doer, she was helping everybody, and she made friends right away with anybody that she came in contact with, and was able to help them in very significant ways. And what happened with her is that in her 50s, she started to get arthritis, and it became a very debilitating type of arthritis, so that already in her late 50s, early 60s, she was not very mobile, and it was hard for her to walk. She walked with difficulty, and she became pretty severely handicapped. She outfitted her whole house with everything handicapped. My father had died already, and so everything became like for a handicapped person inside, and she had like a wheelie-dealy kind of scooter that she was able to go all over the house with. And she even had a van which had a lift in it, so she was able to go into the van and then shift to the driver's seat, and she was still able to drive and go around, but still it was very significantly different than the life that she had lived. And she would be the type that went to everybody's simcha, all the happy times, a wedding, bar mitzvah, a bris, all those things. And she would also go, of course, for the sad times, the shivas, the funerals, things like that. And so she could no longer really go as much as she had liked to go earlier. And of course, she would call the people and she would speak to them. But she did even more than that. And I watched her really, really redefine her life. Let me just cut out for a moment. And I watched her as she was redefining her life. She went through a very hard time. It was very, very difficult, very, very, very big struggle, quite traumatic for her. But I watched her be successful over time. And so what she used to do is, aside from calling people, she would write letters to them about their happy times that they were going through and that she was sorry she missed it, or the sad times and that she was with them in the sad times. And she would say really deep and meaningful things, to the point where when she died, tons of people brought these letters to my siblings and I for us to read. And some of these letters have been written 10 or 15 years before, but everyone explained to us separately that they cherished these letters. They read them often, that they gave them a lot of strength to go on and things like that. And so I thought that was just like a phenomenal thing. And so my mother was really able to redefine her life in a really special way, in a really big way. And so this is something we have to think about when we go through, how we may have to redefine our life through the troubles and the traumas that we go through. But yet we can still live a life that's very much worth living, and we can really actualize our potentials. I would liken it almost to that proverbial brick wall, and God shoves us up against that brick wall with our suffering and our difficulties, and he says, grow, because I made you. I know your soul and I know what you're capable of. And you have so much more that you need to tap out and take it out of potential, bring it into something that's actual and something that's real. And that's really what happens. That's really one of the ideas that we can understand as we go through our lives. It's kind of like when the Jews left Egypt after 210 years of being slaved, and the Egyptians were following after them, wanting to kill them, and all of a sudden the Jews run up against the Red Sea. What are they supposed to do? Egyptians behind them, Red Sea in front of them. And so God again, at that point, proverbial brick wall, he says, grow. I'm pushing you into this. Let's see. You have free choice, but let's see what you're going to do. And you have a lot of faith, he said, basically, but you can tap out some more. And let's see what you're going to do. And they did. They raised their hearts and their souls, their hands, their faces, their eyes to the heavens, and they prayed. And they developed a higher level of faithfulness, and the rest is history. So this happens again and again for us all the time. There's a very special rabbi who lived in Poland. His name was the Kutzker. He was actually a Hasidic rabbi. And he has a lot of sayings that people quote over. He was a very deep and meaningful person. One thing about me is that I also lead trips to Poland and Eastern Europe, and I've been many, many times. There's so much there to gain. It's 1,000 years of Jewish history. It's the Holocaust. And we actually talk about suffering and our troubles and traumas actually on the trip as well. And so we go to the place where this rabbi lived and died. And one of the things that I just like to quote from him, again, the Kutzker Rebbe, so he says the following. He says, be true to yourself, know yourself, and don't fool yourself. Know both whom you are now and whom you can become. And so that's true in general, and it's very focused directive, but it's very much true when we talk about suffering and the difficulties that we go through. And so that's what we have to try to think about as we are experiencing different things. All right, so I'd like to move on and talk about how these ideas are totally connected, but I'm trying to separate them for the purposes of that we can really get in depth and understand them a little bit better. So the idea of suffering is a wake-up call. That's one way we can definitely look at it from God. It's a wake-up call. God's trying to get my attention. He's trying to get your attention when we go through different things. And an allegory that I would use would be, if any of you have dogs, so let's say you wouldn't do this, but let's say you would, and you would hit your dog. And so what would the dog do? So most probably the dogs would first start out and whimper. And then after that, probably about 80 or 85% of the dogs would actually start biting the stick. Let's say you hit the dog with a stick. Now, if the dog could think a little bit further on, he really wouldn't be biting the stick. He should really be biting you, because you're the one that's holding the stick that's hitting him. And so that's exactly what happens when God gives us a wake-up call with all kinds of suffering. So we do have to respond with the choices, our outlook, our attitude, dealing with the situation and trying to handle it as best as possible. That's all 100% true. But not to lash out, God, how could you do this to me? But what's the message? Is there a message? It's a wake-up call. What's happening? And how can I look at this and to try to respond with trying to deepen myself, make my life more and real and better, gain a connection with God, all those different kind of things. I'm generalizing totally, and you have to, if you're going through something or have gone through something, it's worth it to find someone to talk with and to try to see how you can understand the things that are going on in your life and that you can make changes to live a better life, a higher life, a more enriched life because of what you're going through, and not to let it break you. And so that's something that is really just super important that we have to try to follow through with. It reminds me of the idea that is in the 23rd Psalm written by King David. Now, King David had a rough life. He lived only for 70 years, and he had a really, really, really hard life. And it really pushed him to totally build a close relationship with God through it all. And that's really what Psalms is. And so in the 23rd Psalm, very famous, I'll say it in Hebrew and English, it says, Gam ki elech b'gates al-maves, that I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Lo ira ra, I don't fear any evil. I don't fear anything bad. Ki ata imadi, because you are with me. And then it goes on, it says, Shiftecha u'mishantecha hema inachamuni. Shiftecha is a shevet, is something that you would hit someone, or maybe a shepherd would hit his sheep with to prod them to go in some direction. And the shevet and the mishenet is a staff, a cane. that you would lean on for support. And so King David says, I may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, been through many difficult things. He says, don't fear any evil, don't fear any bad. There's no such thing as evil or bad. Ki ata imati, because you're with me, and whether you're prodding me and I'm feeling suffering and having loss and tragedy in my life, or I feel your support and I'm leaning on you like a cane, hima yanachamuni, both of them comfort me because I'm alive and I have a relationship with you. And whatever it is, the good and the bad, it's all coming from you, God. And so that ultimately is, again, Gams Latova, it's ultimately all a good thing. And here, maybe as we're saying, it's a wake up call. I'm able to grow. I can actualize my potential. So many different ideas because I'm alive and because you're with me. And so it can't be evil. It can't be bad. It's got to all be good because it's all helping me on some level. And the bottom line is, if you haven't had any struggles or traumas or difficulties or suffering in the last little while, so check your pulse because maybe you're not really alive because everybody has them. And there's, again, deep reasons like we're talking about that really makes sense for us to have them so that we really can grow. And again, these are the things that we would really mostly want to run from. And these are ideas that the things that happen in our lives are not anything that we really want. And we're actually allowed to pray that they are taken away. God, please take them away, but let me learn. The idea of the prayer should be, let me learn the meaning behind it of how I'm supposed to grow. Let me grow. Let me deepen myself. Let me have a deeper relationship with you. Let me enhance myself without this trauma and the struggle that I'm going through now. That we're actually allowed to do. And that's an important thing. And I'd like to also share another continued story with my mother in terms of the development of her potentials and actualizing her potentials and how far she really came in her life. And so that's the continuation of what happened in her life. So she had that arthritis. And we thought, my siblings and I thought it was going to be a situation where eventually she was going to be totally debilitated, but that's actually not what happened at all. Both of my parents died at around the age of 70, 5 years apart. And that's just another thing in terms of this is many, many years ago. And that's part of what's actually pushed me to develop myself some, because I lost my parents when I was not very old. And I have grown through the difficulties of losing parents. I mean, obviously, emotionally, it's very, very difficult always. But it's actually led me into certain avenues of psychology, grief counseling, crisis intervention counseling, so I can hopefully help people who are going through similar things than I have, as I have. Anyway, back to my mom. So what happened is that she went into the hospital for just a very small procedure with something, and they did a routine chest x-ray. And so that chest x-ray showed that she had stage 4 cancer, lung cancer. And stage 4 is very serious. And one of my brothers happens to be an oncologist, and when he saw the report, he understood that it was a very, very fast-growing cancer. There's a lot of different types of lung cancers, and according to nature anyway, he did not think my mother had more than just a couple of months. And so at that point, she had no symptoms, and she was feeling great. She was feeling fine, except for her arthritis, and we did not know what was to come. I had a couple of deep conversations with her during those few days. I was not where she was in Memphis. And she always called my siblings and I her rabbis because we were the ones that did have the Jewish education, and my parents came to it a little later on, and being Bali Tshuva. And so we used to discuss a lot of different things. And so literally the day after diagnosis, this is a devastating diagnosis, right? And she asked me questions about repentance, teshuva. She wanted to understand how could she just continue to fix her life, rectify her life, put everything in order spiritually if she didn't have all that much time left. And I was completely astounded. But we talked about it, and I walked her through the stages, and we spoke, and it was really beautiful, deep, meaningful conversation. And then a day or two later, we were talking about a lot of things, and she asked me, well, is it the same in terms of what we spoke about was between man and God in terms of repentance? But she's like, is it the same thing between man and man? If we have a, little fight or discrepancy with someone and there was a fallout, is that still the same thing? Can I just do my repentance like we talked about? And I said, no, Mom, it's a little bit different. We have to add on some other things and speak to the person, work it out with the person. And she got off the phone with me, what I found out subsequently, and she called a particular person that she had quite an argument with several years before, and she worked it out right then, right there. Now, unbeknownst to us is that she had just about 5 days after the diagnosis, and then all the symptoms of her lung cancer kicked in, and she had a massive stroke, which knocked out pretty much most of her brain, and for the remaining 10 weeks of her life, she was in a full coma. And what she did during those 5 days was just absolutely incredible to me, how she thought deeply, she rectified her own things in her own life, and was really trying to put everything into place. And like I said, my parents were very good role models for me. But look at how much she had developed herself to that point. And then, of course, when she was in the coma, she probably really couldn't do any of that. There is a very interesting story in terms of the gift of life and this idea that I'd like to move into, which is, again, all connected. And that is that there's value in suffering, that it's not random, and that it means many things, and that it ultimately helps us and can help us with many things in this second gestational world where we're trying to develop our soul. We do it through physical means. We have a body, we have a soul, and they're a dynamic duo. And that's what we're supposed to be doing as we go through this life with every opportunity that God gives us. And so this is a pretty famous story, and it's meant to be publicized, and I'd like to actually read it for you now. There was a rabbi who was giving a medical ethics class to a bunch of doctors in Jerusalem, and all different types of doctors. And so when he finished this class, a particular non-religious Jewish doctor came over to him and said the following. So I'm just going to read it. So the doctor says to the rabbi, he says, there was a lonely old man on the ward who was being kept alive on a respirator. He was really, just lost my place. He said there was really no family to look after him. Since there was nobody to pull the plug, I had mercy on him and I pulled the plug, the doctor said. I didn't really think much of it. I actually thought I was doing a good thing for him. But that night, I had a dream. The deceased man came to me and said, I'm summoning you to the court on high. You took away 11 days of my life. In those 11 days, I would have been cleansed of my earthly blemishes. Now, however, because you deprived me of my suffering down there, I am incomplete and I am suffering up here. Naturally, I ignored the dream, the doctor said to the rabbi, but the next night I had the exact same dream. I ignored it again, but it reoccurred a third time. Actually, it reoccurred a third time last night. Now I'm afraid that this is much more than a dream. I think that the deceased man is really communicating with me, and I need your advice. Rabbi, what do you think I should do? So the rabbi answered him. He says, since Jewish law views pulling the plug as an act of murder, even if you allow yourself to feel sincere remorse, which is tshuva, repentance, which I was just talking about, which is an amazing, special, incredible topic. But even if you allow yourself to feel and you work through your remorse, you will at best only remove the blemish from your soul. Such remorse, however, cannot remove the negative effect on the person who has been deprived of 11 days of his life. Therefore, I recommend that you publicize this story in the hope that as a result, people will come to appreciate the gift of life. The merit of that should stand for the deceased man to relieve his suffering. And so this is just a beautiful story which shares with us how precious and priceless life is, every moment of it, and how nothing is random. Everything happens exactly as it's supposed to. And the truth is, during the last 10 weeks of my mother's life that she was in that full coma, I spoke to some rabbis about it, and I asked them about it in terms of Jewish outlook, and that's really pretty much the answer that they said, that it's actually taking care of some great things. It looks terrible down here to us. We're, again, so myopic. We only see just a piece of the picture. And it's doing wonderful things for my mother's soul, and that's how I should look at it. And so I really thought about it, and I was able to handle it. Of course, doesn't mean it was easy going through that, and of course, losing my mother and all those kind of things, but it definitely gave some deeper meaning into the whole idea. And so that's how we can try to understand it. I'd like to share a parable, an allegory with you that comes from the great rabbi, the Chafetz Chaim, who died in 1933 in Europe. And he is talking about that after that second gestational period and a person, after they live their life, a soul goes back up to the spiritual realm. And there's going to be some sort of a court case. And in this mashal, this parable from the Chafetz Chaim, he says a soul died, a person died, and the soul goes up, and there was a very big measurement scale that was there. And loud voice, a heavenly voice, said that all the good deeds and the angels that were created from the good deeds and the mitzvos and all the wonderful things that that soul did during its lifetime should come and get on the scale. And so all these angels in white, again, allegory, came and they hopped on one side of the scale, and the scale went down significantly. And then the voice, this heavenly voice, said, all the angels that were created from all the bad deeds, the sins, the way that the soul didn't handle things properly, should come and get on the other side of the scale. So these troops of black angels came and they got on the other side of the scale and weighed it down even more. And so the soul was shaking, thinking that not good things were in store for it, and didn't really know what to do at that point. And then immediately there was another sound, another loud voice, a heavenly voice that said the following: now it's time for all the pain, the suffering, the trauma, the difficulty, the tragedy, the struggles that this soul went through, every single moment of it, they should all come, and all that pain and tragedy should come and should go onto the scale on the side of the merits, on the side of the good deeds. And so there was a lot of pain and misery and difficulty and tragedy and trauma that all hopped on that scale, and that side of the scale went down even farther. And at that point, the Chafetz Chaim says the soul realized that the pain, the trauma, the tragedy, the loss of a lifetime actually saved him. And now his soul was destined for a very special place in the heavens. And so that is really a deep way that we can think about things and try to work things through as we go through our lives. Life is precious, every moment of it, even with the difficulties. I'd like to give you a little bit of homework because aside from the other things that I do, I'm also a teacher. And if you're not familiar with this, you should look it up and you should actually start saying it. So in the very beginning of the Siddur, of a prayer book, we say the most beautiful thing that we're supposed to actually verbalize in the morning. It's a little quick prayer to God. We're supposed to say it when we're hardly entirely awake and we're just starting to get up. And if you don't have this, so find that prayer book, write it down, keep it by your bed, and keep it on an index card, and you should really say it every morning. And it's the most beautiful concept because we bring in God right away into our day, which is amazing for faith. And also, it's got a beautiful message to it. And so here it is. It's one sentence. It says, Moda'ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. Thank you, O lasting, everlasting, and life-giving God. Shechazarta bi nishmasi v'chemla, that you have returned my soul in mercy to me, that I'm waking up to another day. Rabba emunasecha, great is your faith in me. Now it's interesting because we have a lot of classes that talk about faith in God and how to build a relationship with God, and it's a super big, important topic. But this is different. We start our day fresh, having woken up to another day of life, and we thank God for giving us our soul back and for having faith in us. God has faith in me to get it right this time, to make good decisions today, to handle my life in a better way, to accomplish, seize those days, seize those moments, and to live a life worth living, because God believes in me. And as we know, of times recent, there are people who just don't wake up to another day of life. And so even waking up to another day of life with the struggles, the loss, the trauma that we go through, it's still worth it, because this is our second gestational period and we can create eternity. And so I'd like to finish with a blessing, a bracha to all of us, that we should really be able to live a life that's worth living and create meaning in our life through the good times, the medium times, and the very low suffering times, and that we should really be able to crystallize our life here and create eternity and that development of soul as we go through all the different things that God has in store for us moment to moment. Thank you very much for listening.